Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Attorney General Jeff Sessions just said on O'Reilly's show that it's time to clamp down on sanctuary cities. Well, with that in mind, we speak to a lawmaker who says there is nothing wrong with elected officials undermining immigration law. But first,
anti-worker, anti-poor, Charles Murray, no more.
Public safety.
Anti-worker,
to go and
anti-poor,
I'm going to do it.
Charles Murray.
well, the forces of tolerance did their best today to stop another Charles Murray event from taking place. The sociologist spoke at Villanova, but he had to be escorted out for his own safety after several people disrupted the event and called him a white supremacist. Murray returned after several people were rejected by the police. George Ciccariello-Maher is a professor at nearby Drexel University and a self-described radical political theorist. 2 days ago, he urged the disruption of Murray's speech, calling on students to, quote, make this impossible. Professor Ciccariello-Maher joins us tonight from Mexico City. Professor, thanks for coming on. I wonder if you see something inconsistent with someone who teaches at a university dedicated to the idea of the open exchange of ideas, calling for ideas he disagrees with to be shut down.
I think we should be clear that universities are actually spaces for rational ideas, for arguments that are based in fact and evidence. And the reality is that Charles Murray has never based his arguments in evidence or facts. He has never passed any kind of rigorous academic examination of those ideas. He doesn't publish with academic presses. Instead, he's actually had his research paid for by right-wing think tanks. They've paid for him to write books like The Bell Curve. They paid for those books to be published, and then they actually paid for journalists to read and take seminars on those books to spread the gospel, as it were. So this is kind of the worst kind of pseudo-intellectual pay for play, and that doesn't guarantee you a platform on a university campus.
So because he hasn't been published in academic journals and hasn't passed through the gauntlet of other professors assessing his work, though of course he has, because he has been an academic, but by that standard, I don't know, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, none of them, I recall, publishing in academic journals. Is their writing also out of bounds on Drexel's campus?
So I think the question is really also about the content of these writings. Let's be clear. This is someone who is defined as a white nationalist by the Southern Poverty Law Center, someone who burned crosses in his youth and went on to play a role in violent counterinsurgency during the Vietnam War, and then who went on to support mass incarceration, the gutting of welfare.
Okay, let me just stop you there. Just back up one step. He burned crosses in his youth. I know Charles Murray. I know quite a bit about him. I've read his books. I'm sure, unlike you. I'm not familiar with that. Can you substantiate that claim?
Okay, well, you should have done research. It doesn't take much research to realize that this is something that happened. He claimed it wasn't racist, which might be plausible were it not for the fact that he went on to basically make a constant eugenic argument for racial inferiority to the rest of his career, arguing that black Americans and that Latinos are inferior.
I don't want to get hung up, but since we're having a debate about what is accurate and what is not, what are you talking about? Charles Murray was a member of the Klan? I mean, what you can't throw these things out here. I know it's not an academic journal, but substantiate that claim, please.
Now, I mean, Tucker, I'm pretty sure you know what Google is, and I'm pretty sure you know how to do research. And if you did that, then you would realize that this is something he's admitted to, although he claimed that it had no racial undertones. Unfortunately, as I said, he went on to write that blacks and Latinos are racially inferior, that they're genetically debased. And he's gone on more recently, actually, this might be interesting for your audience, that he's gone on more recently to actually argue that poor whites are becoming genetically inferior as well. This is someone who uses the most flimsy pseudoscience that's been debunked in every way possible, and yet people continue to take it seriously because it makes them feel better. So
look, you're saying that someone who makes racially inflammatory claims that haven't been vetted by the academic establishment shouldn't be allowed to speak on a college campus, and yet people have said that of you. You called on Twitter for, and I'm quoting, white genocide, obviously a racially inflammatory thing to say. People tried to shut you down, and you called those people a mob and defended academic freedom when it applied to you. How is he more racially inflammatory than you calling for white genocide?
It's interesting. I'm losing my faith. I'm really losing my faith in your ability to use Twitter. I mean, to use Google, because if you used Google, the first thing you would realize is that, of course, white genocide is not a real thing. It's a racial fantasy of the kind that Charles Murray and his ilk like to put forward.
But
and
you
when you
called
put forward these arguments,
Twitter.
I'm not saying that no one should be. I'm not saying they shouldn't be allowed on campus. I'm saying that they haven't earned any kind of platform on campus, and the free speech rights of those who are most affected by that racist hate speech comes into play. They're able to protest as they did today. They protested today peacefully at Villanova before they were attacked.
Nobody takes you seriously I'm trying to take you seriously. You're accusing this guy of racial demagoguery, and you called for white genocide. You also applauded the Haitian Revolution for killing whites. Look, those are your views. I'm not saying you shouldn't be allowed to express them. I'm merely pointing out the irony that you're trafficking in race hatred, and yet saying that Charles Murray shouldn't be allowed to speak because he traffics in race hatred. Are you self-aware enough to catch that?
I actually believe, I believe in a very fundamental way that all people are equal. What's very interesting and different is that Charles Murray does not, and he's dedicated his life to arguing that people are inferior and that those inferior people should not have access to education, should not have access to social welfare.
I think he's argued for genocide.
Should be out of higher education.
Okay, right. I doubt you've read a Charles Murray book, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt.
Supported by.
Okay, but answer my question. You called for white genocide, and I'm not making it up. It actually got a lot of attention. Are you going to defend that as a principled academic stand? I mean, what does that mean exactly? And
I really, maybe I gave you too much credit. Maybe I thought you were too smart. Maybe I thought that you would actually do your research and figure out, for example, what is satire, what's clearly satire, what talks about an imaginary concept of white genocide, which is upheld by the likes of Steve Bannon and all these alt-right figureheads who actually think that white people in the United States are under existential threat. I do not believe that.
Okay, so here's something that I don't even understand the answer, but I'm going to pass on to something you said just a couple days ago, and this is on your Twitter account. You said, some guy gave up his first-class seat for a uniformed soldier. People are thanking him. I'm trying not to vomit or yell about Mosul. Was that satire too? What does that mean? Or are you going to blame Steve Bannon for that as well?
I think it's really irresponsible to blindly support, for example, wars that send off young people into combat, risk their lives, kill many others, as we've just seen in Mosul, 200 people incinerated by U.S. bombs, and to not do that in a way that expands anyone's freedom, that makes anyone less secure. The Iraq War has not protected anyone's
you're blaming
freedom.
The soldier. You're not blaming the policymakers. You're saying You're saying giving up a seat for a soldier in uniform made you want to vomit. You're not saying giving up a seat for the guy who made the war policy, but for the soldier, the guy who's risking his life. Why'd that make you feel like throwing up?
I think U.S. troops need real support. They don't need symbolic gestures. What they need is not a first-class seat. What they need is healthcare support, psychological support. Women in uniform need to not be subjected to an epidemic of sexual assault. And more than anything, they don't need to be deployed, have their lives risked, be taken away from their families for wars that do nothing and no good for anyone.
But why is it bad to give, okay, that's fine, but why is it bad to give him a first-class seat? I'm missing that. Someone's trying to be nice to the guy who's going through all these hardships you just described, and that makes you mad. Why?
I'm all for generous gestures devoted toward those who most deserve them in our society, and I have the deepest respect for anyone who, particularly for economic reasons, makes difficult decisions, whether it's joining the military, whether it's doing other dangerous work that has to take place in our society, whether it's being an economic migrant. And I think these people all deserve better. They deserve to not have to join the military if they would rather just get an education.
But he did. He doesn't have a government-subsidized job at a university like you. So why
returning to not have the health care and the psychological support that they need. This is how we support the troops, not by sending them off into wars.
Okay. So you began this conversation with reference to your own scholarship and the academic journals that you and your fellow professors publish in. And because I do want to take you seriously, I actually spent some time reading some of them today. And I want you to explain to me what this means. Now, I was an editor for a long time, not an academic press, but an editor. You wrote a piece called Dual Power in the Venezuelan Revolution. This is the second paragraph, and I'm quoting it. By viewing the process through the Leninist concept of dual power, that is the construction of an autonomous alternative power capable of challenging the existing state structure, we can see that the establishment of communal councils in Venezuela is clearly a positive step toward the development of fuller and deeper democracy, which is encouraging in and of itself. Now, that's a sentence with too many adjectives, a passive construction, imprecise language. It's high school writing. It's crap. And I'm wondering, is your scholarship serious?
I really appreciate you digging into the vaults. I appreciate you digging into the vaults to actually closely read some of my
You're not
writings.
an impressive scholar. Really, that's what I'm saying. You're a performance artist. That's not impressive.
That's shown himself unable to use Google today. This is really interesting. I've got 3 books
What does that
published,
mean? I just read...
I don't need to flout academic credentials in front of you.
But you're not capable of writing a clear sentence. Now, I went through a lot of different essays that you wrote, and I've got an IQ above room temperature, and I couldn't understand any of them because your writing is childlike. It's childlike.
This is strange.
And I'm wondering,
almost as though your entire
can you
shtick today
explain
is to show
what that
you're
means?
incapable of grasping very simple and very basic things.
Okay,
I've done
so what
extensive
is
studies on popular power in Venezuela, on the development of what are called communal councils. I know them better than most, and I know what it means to develop these participatory institutions of democracy in Venezuela. I'm glad to talk about them. But if your entire shtick is to come on here and say that you can't understand basic English and basic sentences, I'm really not sure where to start.
But it's not basic English. I've spent a lot of time writing and editing basic English, and it's designed to make the idea clearer, not to cloak them from people. So two things are going on. Either you don't really know what you're saying because you don't understand it yourself, or you're trying to hide it from the person for whom you're writing. And neither one is impressive. And I guess my point is, the only writing I have read by you that I can understand clearly are your tweets. And they seem to be designed to shock people, to get attention. It seems, again, a species of performance art, not scholarship. Has this occurred to you?
I mean, performance art is scholarship. Let's be real about that. But you seem to be able to understand the very short pieces that I write, and yet when you sit down to try to read the longer things, you suddenly want to perform your own inability to actually read and to digest. Plenty of people have read my work; they appreciate it, and yet you're here defending someone like Charles Murray, who very few people defend, who is a
I'm not defending Charles Murray.
Racist.
I'm defending
about them. We're here talking about.
I'm defending his right to say what he thinks. And I think that underpins all scholarship, is the right of people to say what they believe. We call it free speech. It's enshrined in the Bill of Rights, in the First Amendment to that bill. So I'm just surprised that you're not for that, but then I guess I shouldn't be, because you defend Hugo Chavez. But let me just ask you one final question. If your tweet...
Now, at no point in the First Amendment does it say that no one should use their free speech to protest. And I think you know that perfectly well.
No, but it's not a question of protesting.
Does it say that free speech should not be loud, it should not be disruptive, it should not be unruly. These are things that have a long and venerated tradition in the United States.
And I'm not against protest, as you know.
Free speech is very different.
You're not protesting, Professor. You're trying to prevent a man...
to an academic platform.
It's silly. You're trying to prevent him from saying what he thinks.
Right-wing think tanks.
Okay. Last question. The tweet that you're unwilling to defend about feeling nauseous as you see a man in uniform getting a first-class seat, you protected that. You prevented the public from seeing that right after you tweeted it. If you're proud of what you think and you can defend what you think, why did you do that?
I believe absolutely in the right of people to use these platforms. I believe in the right of Charles Murray, of course, to take to Twitter and to say, you know, to spew his kind of violent racism. But that doesn't mean that he should be invited onto a university campus to do so.
I'm sorry. I don't have a lot of time. I just want you to answer my question.
Those people that he says are inferior, those people that he says are inferior have every right to protest to him, to take to the streets, to demand that he not be able to speak.
But you're not answering my question.
Their existence as human beings.
You're going on racism,
inferior.
Okay.
Yes.
I got it.
It's racism.
Are you going to answer my question?
If you don't want to recognize Charles Murray as a racist,
why are you protecting your Twitter feed if you can defend your position? Why are you hiding it from the public?
Sometimes you need to protect your Twitter feed when people who like to go on and on about free speech decide that it's time to violently threaten people who are using that free speech. I would not violently threaten a Charles Murray.
Says the man who called for white genocide.
And yet,
you didn't major in irony, I can see, Professor.
Right to go speak at Villanova.
I gotta go.
Absolutely absurd.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Have fun in Mexico City. Well, for more on the disrupted speech by Charles Murray at Villanova, we go to Fox's Rob Schmidt, who is at the school now. Hey, Rob.
Hey, Tucker, yeah, it was an interesting day here. Charles Murray came here to talk about a government that he says has grown too big, to give kind of a grim picture at the future of America. But it was tough for him to do that today. And a book from his past that you guys have been talking about, The Bell Curve, actually the reason that protesters showed up here today, a few of them anyway, calling him a racist, interrupting a lecture that he was giving to a small group here. Some of the highlights from that were one protester spitting in the face of a student that came to watch the lecture, and also another one who argued, while arguing for his own right to free speech, told Mr. Murray that he would not be able to speak. Here's another one. We'll show you now.
Anti-worker, anti-poor, Charles Murray, no more.
Public safety.
Anti-worker,
To go and
anti-poor,
I'm going to do it.
Charles Murray, no more.
Well, Murray, a libertarian political scientist, created quite a stir back in the 90s when he published The Bell Curve. It's a book that in part tied the IQ of Americans to how successful they will be, and also published IQ averages of Americans according to ethnicity. And just to go through the four there that were published, in first place, certain sects of Jews. Second place, East Asian Americans, as far as IQ goes. In third place, white Americans, such as Charles Murray himself, and in fourth place, African Americans. So, of course, this drew a lot of controversy at the time and has for years now, though the book is scientific. And Murray says that the findings of it are largely supported by the American Psychological Association. He has been branded as a racist by a number of people on the left. And he has been protested quite a bit in a very polarized time we're in right now. He's been protested quite a bit here in just the last few weeks, including a few weeks ago in Vermont at Middlebury College, where the protests turned violent, and actually a professor that was with Mr. Murray ended up in the hospital with a concussion. We spoke to some who attended today's lecture about the hatred for Mr. Murray, and we asked them about what they thought of the lecture and what they thought about such violence and such hatred towards this man.
I understand why people are protesting, and I understand the heightened sensitivity to these kinds of things, but at the same time, I understand his trying to further his knowledge with science.
The faculty in universities across the country votes 90 to 95% left liberal. Yeah. They view free speech as the enemy of moral truth at this point, and so it just has to be tamped down.
Well, a few of the protesters had to be escorted out by police. Murray was able to finish the speech, though interrupted a number of times. And he actually clarified the findings from his book, The Bell Curve, to a young African-American student who went up to protest him. And I'm not sure that he won her over, but he certainly did make an impression on her and really kind of soften the mood in the room. Tucker, we'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Rob. Pretty sure The Bell Curve was not the book he was there to talk about, actually, but no one paid attention to that. Up next, the Senate held hearings on Russia's role in the 2016 election. We considered inviting a senator on tonight, but instead we invited someone who actually knows what he's talking about because he speaks Russian, unlike everyone else talking about this. Also, a lawmaker in Massachusetts is rallying to the defense of a colleague who tried to help illegal immigrants hide from federal authorities. He'll be here to explain why it's okay for some laws to be ignored and which ones. A helpful guide for you at home. Stay tuned. The Senate held a public hearing today about alleged Russian hacking in the 2016 election. During the hearing, Senator Marco Rubio said he's been targeted by Russian hackers as recently as yesterday.
In July of 2016, shortly after I announced that I would seek re-election to the United States Senate, former members of my presidential campaign team who had access to the internal information of my presidential campaign were targeted by IP addresses with an unknown location within Russia. That effort was unsuccessful. I'd also informed the committee that within the last 24 hours, at 10:45 a.m. yesterday, a second attempt was made, again, against former members of my presidential campaign team who had access to our internal information, again targeted from an IP address from an unknown location in Russia, and that effort was also unsuccessful.
Well, meanwhile, Carter Page, who was often identified as a Trump advisor, but whom the Trump people deny ever really was, denied collaborating with the Russians in any way during an interview with our own Catherine Herridge. Here's part of it.
The stuff about me is just literally completely false in every way, shape, and form.
Do you know this former British intelligence officer, Christopher Steele?
I've never met him.
Well, that's not the only Russian news today. The Wall Street Journal tonight reports that former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who appears to have gone completely off the deep end, has offered to testify about Russia in return for immunity from prosecution. What to make of all of this? Well, Stephen Cohen is a contributing editor at The Nation magazine. He's also professor emeritus of Russian studies at Princeton and NYU, one of the eminent Russia scholars in the world. And unlike most people talking about this, actually speaks fluent Russian. Professor Cohen joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on. So, let me just say that there are a lot of strands to this story, a lot of things I don't understand. It seems pretty clear that General Flynn behaved in ways that are very hard to defend. But at the core of this story is the allegation that the Russian government hacked our election. It is a phrase people are using. Broke into email accounts at the DNC and over in the campaign office and used those to help Trump win. Everyone assumes this is true. We're all operating on the assumption that it's true. Do we know it's true?
No.
And if you listen to the hearings at the Senate today, repeatedly it was said, particularly by Senator Warner, the Democratic co-chair of the proceedings, that Russia had hijacked our democracy.
Right.
And what he means is that the Russians, at Putin's direction, had gone into the Democratic National Committee's emails, which were embarrassing to Mrs. Clinton, given them to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks then released them to damage Mrs. Clinton and put Trump in the White House. This is a very dramatic narrative. And they're saying in Washington that this was an act of war. Let me repeat, Tucker. They are saying this was an act of war. So whether or not it's true is existential. Are we at war?
Right.
I got interested in this, not because it's my expertise, but because one of the things I've studied for 40 years is Russian leadership. I've written biographies. I got interested in Putin. I'm writing about Putin, a long piece now. So I looked into it to see if it made sense that Putin could have or did do such a thing. And I can find not one piece of factual evidence. The only evidence ever presented was a study hired by the Clintons, the DNC, to do an examination of their computers. They concluded the Russians did it. Their report has fallen apart. The question is why the FBI decided to use that private kind of private detective, let's say, as though the New York police department had decided for a murderer to hire a private detective. Why the FBI didn't do their own investigation. And that's all we have.
That's all we have, and yet night after night, I get people on both sides, Republicans as well, saying 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, by the way, that would include Coast Guard intelligence, I guess they're on this too, have concluded that the Russian government was behind this. Have they not concluded that?
They say that, but it's bogus. When Clapper, the head of whatever it's called, Director of National Intelligence, signed that report in January, technically he represents all 17. I'll bet you a dime to a nickel you couldn't get a guest on, unprepared, who could name 10 of them. This figure 17 is bogus. But the point here is critical. The one agency that could conceivably have done a forensic examination on the Democratic computers is the National Security Agency. We learned from Snowden, they're in your computer, mine, our e-phones.
Yes.
Everybody else who signed that report said they were highly confident. The NSA said it was only moderately confident. You don't get married based on moderate confidence. You don't go to war with Russia. You don't stage this theater that's going on in Washington which could destroy a presidency. But there's one other thing, and let me leave you with this. When they admit they have no evidence, they fall back on something else, which I think is very important. They say Putin directed Russian propaganda at us and helped elect Trump. I don't know about you, Tucker, but I find that insulting because the premise they're putting out in Washington in this hearing is that the American people are zombies or lambs that'll fight, I'm mixing my metaphors, any Judas goat, anywhere Putin leads them. It's the premise of democracy that we're democratic citizens, that we have a BS detector in us and we know how to use it. But they're telling us at Washington, I mean, like what Rubio's telling us. I mean, every politician who loses election here in America and in Europe is going to say he was hacked by Putin, and that's wrong.
That's right.
And that's what Mrs. Clinton is saying.
And they've also never demonstrated, by the way, why Putin exactly would want Trump to win, because Trump's for fracking? I mean, it doesn't, anyway. Professor, thank you for that. And I think it's worth, I don't know the truth, but I do think it's worth asking these questions, and I appreciate your doing that. Thanks for joining us.
Take care.
Up next, a Massachusetts lawmaker is proudly defending her decision to try to sabotage ICE by warning illegal aliens of impending immigration raids. She wouldn't return our calls, so instead we'll talk to another Massachusetts lawmaker who says she did exactly the right thing. That's next.
It clearly makes their own cities less safe.
That was Attorney General Jeff Sessions on the O'Reilly Factor talking about the administration's crackdown on sanctuary cities. Meanwhile, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, State Representative Michelle Dubois says she has no regrets about trying to help sabotage the enforcement of federal immigration law. On Tuesday of this week, she posted rumors that ICE was going to conduct raids in Brockton, Mass, and urged illegals to go into hiding. Her fellow Democrats aren't exactly racing to defend the rule of law. Jamie Eldridge is a Massachusetts state senator. He supports Representative Dubois' efforts and is himself trying to make Massachusetts a sanctuary state for illegal immigrants. Senator Eldridge joins us tonight. Senator, thanks for coming on.
Tucker, thanks for having me on.
So you'd like to see the state of Massachusetts vote to make the Commonwealth a sanctuary for people here illegally, which seems to me legitimate. You know, voting on things, making laws, great. If you're able to do that, how would you feel if a sheriff in Massachusetts encouraged people to ignore the law that you passed? Do you think he should be punished for doing that?
I don't know if they should be punished. I think when we're talking about Representative Dubois, look, she was looking out for the best interests of her entire community. We know that these ICE raids have been incredibly destabilized to communities. They actually cause immigrants, whether legal or undocumented, to have less trust in calling the police about a crime. So she was really looking out for the best interests of all of our constituents, including the immigrants in her district. Okay. And that's why we filed the Safe Communities Act to limit police interaction with ICE raids.
Right. I get all that. I've heard all that a lot. There's no social science to suggest that any of this makes the community safer, but whatever. The point is...
No, there is. There's studies that say that sanctuary cities are safer. There is.
They are safer, but not because they're sanctuary cities. There's no proof of that. But here's the point. Is it a little weird for lawmakers to be encouraging people to ignore the law?
Well, look, we all have different approaches as legislators. In the district I represent, when we've heard rumors about ICE raids, what I've done is reached out to the police so they can reach out and check with ICE agents to see if this is happening, because, with the disturbing Trump, in my opinion, xenophobic policies of ICE deportations, making everyone a priority for deportation if you're undocumented, we need some limits at the state level with our taxpayer dollars, with our state and local police, not only because it'll make communities more safe, but it's also something that will limit the fear that many immigrant communities are feeling right now.
But I mean, can we just be real? You do this for a living. You know how this works. Trump didn't write these laws. He didn't pass these laws. He's not a legislator. He's not a lawmaker. He's enforcing laws that are on the books that were passed with a lot of Democrats voting for them. So what he's saying is...
But with some very disturbing executive orders. Tucker, there's executive orders prioritizing everyone for deportation.
The basic immigration law is clear to everyone who lives here, which is there's a process by which you get to come here, you get a green card, you get a visa of some kind, and if you don't have that, you're not allowed to be here. That's the law. It was passed by Congress. It's been that way for 240 years. Nothing to do with Trump. And so my question is, do lawmakers get to decide which legitimately passed laws they're going to try to subvert or not? Can you kind of see the problem here?
Well, I disagree, Tucker, because we're talking about state resources, local and police law enforcement, and yes, at the state level, we get to make decisions about what level of cooperation we have with federal policies, with federal actions like ICE agents. So that's the line we're drawing. It's about federalism.
Because it's not about federalism. Here you had a state lawmaker encouraging people to violate the law and doing so explicitly on social media. How would you, and this is a sincere question, I'm not attacking you, how would you feel if the governor of Massachusetts decided that we don't have to pay federal income taxes because, they're bad and they cost Massachusetts a lot of money? Would you be in favor of that? Should governors or state lawmakers be able to decide that? Or how about federal gun laws? How would you feel about that if the governor said, I'm not enforcing federal gun laws? Is that legitimate too?
Well, if you're talking about state income taxes, not at all, or any taxes, what I'm talking about is we have a federal immigration policy, which is broken. I mean, we need immigration reform, but Republicans in Congress won't pass it. So at the state level, what is the best use of resources? And we've had police chief after police chief in Massachusetts talk about the fact that they would rather direct the resources towards violent criminals, whether those who are undocumented or whether those who are U.S. citizens.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but you're not engaging my question at all. So let's say, again, I'm going to ask you the first question one more time and just see if you will answer it. If you were to pass laws in the state of Massachusetts to make it a sanctuary state, and there was a sheriff somewhere who felt like subverting those laws, doing what you are doing to the feds, but to the state of Massachusetts, would you support his right to do that?
I wouldn't support that because under our bill, we would prohibit sheriffs from collaborating with ICE agents. So that's part of the bill. And again, it's important to talk about these families that are...
You're prohibited from encouraging people to break the law, but you're doing it anyway because you feel like it and you think you're righteous in doing it. But you don't want to let other people make the same moral decisions that you're making, exercise their freedom of conscience? Because why?
Except, Tucker, law officials the other day have to follow state laws. And what we're saying is, how is the best use of state resources? Is it the best use of taxpayer resources to target hardworking families in their communities,
You don't see
giving
the
back,
principle at all,
providing
obviously.
a benefit to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Okay, well, speaking of
I don't
hardworking
think that's a good use of taxpayer dollars.
Okay, so you're from Acton. I know your state well. So you're from Acton, and down in Worcester, which is pretty like a half an hour away. It's pretty close. There was a teacher's aide last month who was murdered. She was strangled in her apartment by a man that we now know last week is an illegal alien. Now, you spent a lot of time talking about how to protect these families, these vulnerable immigrants. How much time have you spent thinking about how to protect people like that woman and her family? What would you say to her family now that she's dead?
Yeah, well, first of all, Worcester is not too far away from my district. I feel horrible for the family, and it's important to remember in reading the facts about how they found Mr. Melendez is that it was local police, it was the district attorney with DNA evidence. ICE agents were not at all involved in catching this person. It was a case of old police work that was able to capture this person.
I get it, but he shouldn't have been here in the first place. I mean, as you know, it was illegal for him to be here. There's no dispute on that. He was an illegal alien. If he hadn't been here, he wouldn't have murdered this woman. So encouraging him to stay here, I'm not accusing you of complicity in her murder, but I'm just saying you can kind of see the connection here as a human being, can't you? Like, what would you say to her parents? Sorry?
I think where I disagree with you is that if we just have a broad brush against all undocumented immigrants, you're not really creating the trust that allows immigrant communities or anyone in a community from feeling comfortable to call the police if they see a crime in their neighborhood, in their
I've
community.
heard that talking point. For last question, who should be deported? We got 11 million odd, maybe more, illegal aliens here in America. Do all of them have the moral right to stay here? Who should we deport now?
Well, we've had past administrations like the Reagan administration that did immigration reform that legalized undocumented immigrants.
Well, what do you
I
think?
think
I mean, should we deport anyone?
Undocumented immigrants who have a violent criminal history, who've committed a violent act, they should be deported. I think that's common sense, and I think people agree with that. But a broad brush, as President Trump's executive orders has done, that prioritizes all undocumented immigrants, including very hardworking families, I think that's outrageous. I think it's xenophobic, and I think it's deeply disturbing.
Xenophobic. All right. Senator, thanks for coming on tonight. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Up next, parents are rallying in Montgomery County, Maryland tonight, demanding justice and accountability after a horrifying rape allegedly occurred at Rockville High School. We'll take you there. Plus, more than 250,000 people have signed a petition demanding Melania Trump move to D.C. immediately for reasons that aren't exactly clear. Is anyone or anything safe from politics these days and the bitterness that seems to follow it everywhere? We've got a panel to discuss that up ahead. Following the rape case in Rockville, Maryland, right outside Washington, in which 2 illegal aliens stand accused of raping a 9th grader at Rockville High School. Well, tonight, concerned parents are rallying at a Board of Education meeting in Montgomery County, Maryland. They're demanding accountability and improved safety at their schools. As we mentioned last week, this alleged rape is not the first violent crime in recent days at Rockville High. Our correspondent Griff Jenkins spoke with a victim there and parents at tonight's rally. Griff, how you doing?
Hey, Tucker, we're outside that Board of Education meeting going late tonight, and right where I'm standing, there were dozens of protesters, as you said, rallying for accountability in the school system. Here's what some of them had to say.
We're worried about the lack of accountability of our school officials and our elected officials.
Parents don't know that they can send their children to school and know that they will be safe.
We have grown men with little to no education that are walking the hallways with our young children, and students and parents are very concerned for safety.
And earlier today, there was some news in that rape case. The judge for the 17-year-old rape suspect denying bail despite the defense attorney giving evidence, new evidence of a further evidence it is a consensual relationship. But the big revelation tonight is a video, a brutal video that occurred 9 days before the alleged rape. It's caught on camera, and it is brutal. Look at this. It is just vicious.
Physically, I'm getting better, but mentally, I'm not getting better because the social media harassment has been worse than the actual attack.
Bullying?
Yeah.
What's happening?
Threats, the video being out there, the memes, everything. The comments.
Mean-spirited?
Yeah.
And you say that hurts worse than the actual physical, brutal assault that you underwent.
Yeah.
And as you and I talked a little bit off camera, there's kind of a message here that both kids and adults need to realize just how damaging this stuff is.
Yeah.
Do you think they know?
No, not the kids.
The kids don't?
No.
And they're the ones that are the meanest.
Yeah.
The school officials did absolutely nothing on March 7th. They didn't call the police. The school resource officer, who is a police officer that is supposed to be at the school, was not there on the property that day, and there was no replacement for him. So the school did not call the police for reasons we can't answer, we don't know. And they didn't call 911 for a young lady who just sustained a head injury.
That brave young woman wanting her voice to be heard, and again, that assault happened 9 days before the alleged rape. The Montgomery County Public Schools putting out a statement saying they are committed to student safety, but that family absolutely not seeing eye to eye with the school system here. We'll see what develops, and it's certainly the reason why there were protesters out here, as we saw earlier. Tucker?
Griff Jenkins in Rockville. Thanks, Griff. Up next, the vice president is taking prudent steps to avoid scandal, so our scandal-mongering media is, of course, ridiculing him. Have we tunneled to a new low in American politics? A panel ahead. Well, the Washington Post recently profiled Second Lady Karen Pence and drew new attention to an old profile of the vice president, her husband, Mike Pence. Way back in 2002, he said that he does not dine alone with any woman aside from his wife and does not drink at parties unless she is with him. It's all anyone can talk about tonight on social media. Ashley Pratt is a conservative commentator. Jillian Turner worked at the White House, National Security Council during Bush and Obama, and they both join us tonight. Holy smokes. To you, Jillian, since you're farther away. It doesn't, I mean, this seems like another opportunity to beat up on evangelicals. They're so weird. But this isn't a crazy view among observant Jews or Orthodox Muslims. Like, a lot of the world feels this way. This is not a crazy thing, is it?
Okay, so do you want me to be honest?
Yes.
The first thing I thought when I read this was, poor Mrs. Pence. Can you imagine all the hundreds of events she gets dragged to all across? I would kill myself.
Okay, well, you live in Washington, so you know what this really means.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
I felt so terrible for her. What a terrible arrangement. She definitely got the short end of the stick.
That's hilarious, but also very true. But actually, it's also true, and you live here as well, people have a tough time keeping their marriages together because it's not a wholesome town.
This city is a cesspool of sin.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I think this is a very interesting conversation to have because I respect their personal choice to do this and keep their marriage together. I think that's why it has worked so well for them. There are a lot of women in power, men in power on both sides of the political spectrum who fall victim to temptation because of these things, and they have tried to eradicate that. That's great. What I don't want to see happen is that women who work in government, let's say, who have ideals or dreams of becoming chief of staff,
right,
can't stay after hours and be around a boss because they may feel uncomfortable in that situation. So I feel like some discussion needs to be around that too, because there are a lot of women, you know, who consider themselves to be at these tables, but maybe feel like they are making their boss's wife uncomfortable by doing it.
Right. Well, I mean, it's a tough thing, and by the way, work relationships do flower sometimes into personal relationships. I mean, that's totally real. But what I'm just struck by is the judgment from people who make a living denouncing others for judging. Clara Jeffrey, editor of Mother Jones, went on this Twitter rant. Clearly a pretty unhappy person, I would guess, in her personal life. But she was like so offended by this. Why be offended by that? That's the part I don't get.
From a values perspective, I have no issue with it. I agree with Ashley, though. When you take this into the professional realm and outside of your personal life, do whatever you want. You be you in your marriage. I'm thrilled for you that you found something that works. I would never want to judge somebody else's relationship. But when it comes to you're a public figure working in the U.S. government, which Vice President Pence has been for many years, how do you make this work so that it's not, you know, extremely disadvantageous for?
No, I get it. And how can you still have dinner with Angela Merkel without
jeopardizing? But I agree with you on the the moral outrage.
Yeah,
that's a little bit.
And speaking of, really quickly, almost 400,000 people have now signed a petition demanding that Melania Trump, the First Lady, move to the White House from New York. She's already announced that she's coming here at some point. after her son finishes his time at school. But there was, for many years, my whole life, you don't attack the First Lady unless, like, she does something really newsworthy. What is this?
This just seems crazy to me, right? Because she has said, and it may be unconventional that she's not in the White House, right? But she's still doing First Lady duties, even still being not in the White House. Right. And because she wants her son to finish school, she's somehow now being blamed. And the reason for it is they're paying an exorbitant amount as taxpayers for her security. What about all the vacations the Obamas went on that taxpayers paid for in exorbitant amounts?
Well, whenever the left is upset about government spending,
yeah, but we can't ever talk about
I
those
wish we had more time. I know you agree, Joni. Thank you.
How can I not agree with that?
Thank you both.